My Paraiso Verde, which is finally throwing nice variegation, but looks like it's standing on a toothpick. If you're a new plant parent or somebody who's been cutting stuff up for a long time, you probably run into a situation where you were afraid of taking a top cut. And you just think to yourself, man, I don't want to put myself in a position where I kill the plant because I couldn't get the damn thing to root. So I really need to cut this thing up and get into a place where it can root a little bit better. It's just barely surviving in here. So if you find yourself in that kind of situation where you're fearful of taking the top cut and you're like, if I can't root this thing, I'm screwed. Or you've put a whole bunch of money into a plant and you think this is the time, I can take the top cut now, but I really need to make sure it roots and I want a really good success rate. Well, I may have a solution for you. This is nothing magical. The process is uncomplicated. It can be as simple as 2 ingredients, container, and some press and seal, and you're done. Hey plant fiends, it's Nick from Proppist. Welcome back, or welcome if you're here for the first time. Glad to have you aboard. I am going to be talking to you today about top cuts. We're going to talk about propagating top cuts and how you can make those root faster, root more cleanly in a place where you can see them, and then even have a better chance of transferring those into something like semi-hydro at the end of the day. So for me, this is super, super important, and particularly I had a really good experience with this recently. I want to show you guys the outcome of that experience and walk you through the process of what worked for me in terms of getting this thing to root super well in such a short time and in actually a really small amount of media. I've been really happy with this process and I want to share that with you. So stick around and I will show you the whole process and how it works. When I talk about top cuts, I'm talking about the top of a plant, the apical bud of a plant. So basically the top little bit of the stem where the new growth comes from, and the first node or first 2 nodes or as many as you want to cut off below that along the stem. Now to give you guys an example of what I'm talking about, a plant can actually have more than one apical bud. This guy actually has 2 because it's been propagated before. So as you can see here, I had chopped the plant right around here and he's actually grown off 2 completely separate growth points, one up here and one down here. Is there even another one? The only limit to the number of top cuts you can take off a plant is basically the number of times you've already propagated it. So if your plant has never been propagated, it's just gonna have that one stem going up with one top node, and that's all you need to go with. Now, in my case here, I might take 2 cuttings. I'm not really sure yet. I may just leave the bottom one, let it go. We'll see, but just want to show you this example here. So this is a Syngonium podophyllum aurea variegata, so a yellow variegated Syngonium. You can see the top few leaves here. Got really nice variegation on this guy here. This guy as well. Got cooked a little bit lower down, so he got a little bit bronzed here. That's not variegation. And I've got a couple green leaves as well, so I'm thinking maybe a propagation is in order on this guy. Also, I might want to sell the growing tip on here. So why would you want to take a top cutting of a plant? Now, there's a whole bunch of different reasons for this. The most common in your home may just be that the plant is getting too tall for the space that you've got it in. In that case, you just want to chop it down, let it start propagating itself from lower down the stem, and then take that top cut and grow it larger. That's the simplest case. Secondarily, you may want to think about something like, I want to take a cutting and give it to a friend, trade it, or sell it. Those are all valid reasons for taking a top cut. And you can do the same thing with mid cuts further down. We're just talking about top cuts today because the technique that I have for you is mostly specific to top cuts. Now, another reason that a plant may need a propagation to the top, or even just further propagation in general, is that it's just growing strangely or it's growing too weirdly in one direction. Maybe you just don't like the growth habit at all. I'll give you an example of this. This guy here is Monstera esqueleto, and it has been growing off its support here because actually I had trimmed it down at this point here. That's where I cut the plant back to just the stem, and it actually grew out this entire huge vine that's going on here, which is like 1 foot plus long from the 2nd or 3rd node down. I think it looks like the 2nd node down. And I had chopped this off because this plant had thrips originally, and it was amongst a large set of plants that got beheaded at the time of thrips. And since then, it decided to not even climb this one little stick that I had here. Clearly, this was at the back of a shelf, and it wasn't really getting much love. And it decided to keep on growing basically along the bottom of the shelf that was on and slightly up the back of a wall. So as you can see, the last couple of leaves are starting to get a little bit bigger, but it's also got arrow roots basically at every node here, which looks really good. So this is a perfect candidate for a top cut, and I'm going to do that just to get it back under control. So it's growing strange, and you kind of want to fix it. I think this is pretty self-explanatory, but if you want to take a top cut here, this is one of several of my Philodendron gloriouses. This guy has been, it decided to grow inside of its pole, which I had not refilled with leca, as you can see here. This, I think, is actually a plant I showed you guys way back in my semi-hydro gear guide video. and it had, again, issues with thrips and underwatering. This was, again, one of the collection of plants that got nailed with thrips at the same time. It's totally come back from that. It's actually put out a couple nice leaves here. This one still has a teensy bit of thrips damage at the bottom, which I think you can probably see with the light. Maybe with the back here you can get a better look at it. And then this brand new leaf at the top, which is just hardening off, looks perfect. So I think this guy is a perfect candidate for a top cut because I want it to size up. So in this case, I'm going to take this top cut, root it, and then start it back down at the bottom of the pole. There's plenty of videos out there on sizing up your plants. I'm trying to do this in a very small container, so I'm just trying to do this kind of once over here and there. Keep taking a top cut, keep taking a top cut until you get the size you're after. Eventually, you're going to need a bigger container as well. But if you're interested in techniques for taking top cuts and propagating plants to get them to size up on moss poles, absolutely go look at Sydney Plant Guy. His videos, and he has a whole playlist on this subject, which is kind of required watching if you want to collect any of these large philodendrons, because that guy has the magic touch with the philodendrons and even with his monstera, but specifically with the melanochrysum, the gigas, the glorious, the splendid. He has huge philodendrons, and they're all growing in his open air home. I mean, I kind of wish I lived in Australia just purely so I could grow really big plants. So another reason you may want to take a top cut, and this kind of, any cutting at this point, but really chopping your plant down from the top cut on down, is if you've lost variegation in a plant and you're trying to get it back. So this example here, it was a Philodendron Florida Beauty, which has reverted on me completely, and the variegated leaves that were down here ended up dropping off due to underwatering. So at this point, there's actually like no variegation left on the leaves, but I'm pretty sure if I take it back down to the stem and propagate from one of the lower nodes, I have a good chance of getting some of that variegation back. What I'm going to do with this guy is not only take a top cut, but I'm probably going to propagate him and take nodes all the way down to the bottom. Maybe leave the bottom 3 nodes in there. Maybe we'll get our variegation back, maybe not, but that's really the only way to try it out. So getting variegation back, or at least attempting to, is another reason. Using this glorious as another example, besides the fact that this one has grown strangely and it's grown into its moss pole, in this case it was a leca pole that I neglected to fill all the way up to the top. It's grown strangely, so I'm going to have to take a cutting just to get it out of there without breaking the stem. The other reason for this is that it's grown super leggy, and this is primarily because of thrips and the fact that it's dropped a lot of leaves. I have a few plants that have gotten a lot leggier than this, that basically, my Majestic has grown literally like 5 feet tall, maybe even taller than that, and it only has leaves at the top. So that would be a perfect example of one that I want to propagate because the plant is too leggy. And by leggy, we're talking about having a very, very long stem with no leaves for the most part. And what we're trying to do is kind of get the plant down to a reasonable size again, where it can start sizing up and not having so much stem just exposed. So there's, again, several reasons you want to do this, but here's one that I think is an interesting case of the plant is getting too big for the space that it's currently in. Arguably also the stem is thickening up really high up here. It actually looks like it's living almost entirely off of aerial roots. That's just because the stem is so skinny down here. So really in this case, this is a Philodendron Paraiso Verde, which actually is one of my nicer Paraiso Verdes. It is really hard to get this variegation to come out in this plant, and I seem to have mastered the variegation trick specifically with this one. I have like 5 other Paraiso Verdes. They're just green. This guy, he's variegated. He looks really nice all the way up. I mean, look at this guy. The leaf's a little bit crispy on it, but that variegation is popping. And this guy's been living very close to my grow light in my grow tent, and with, kind of 60-65% humidity. So light, warmth definitely seems to make a difference with this guy. But as you can take a look there and see, those are not very nice stem to root ratios. This stem is super skinny and it's thickened up right up here. So what I want to do with this guy is I want to get basically rid of the stem piece below here, leave my aerial roots, and get him to reroot a little bit higher up. And he does have a couple of aerial roots that are still looking like they're ready to go and kind of be fresh there. So I'm looking forward to that. You don't really want to propagate or repot a plant when it's literally pushing out a new leaf. And this one is in mid stage. I'm debating whether I'm going to do this one now that I take a good look at it, but we'll see. Now, there'll be a plant I'll show you later that will cover this last couple of reasons here, but one of the reasons that you may want to think about taking a top cut of your plant is if you have root rot or stem rot happening below that part of the plant. So if the top node or nodes are looking all right, but you see that there's stem rot happening further down the plant, that may be a time you want to take the top cut just to be able to save the good portion of the plant. Just make sure at that point that you actually check the cut piece and take a look inside of the stem, make sure there's no rot in there. Otherwise, keep on chopping until you get rid of the rot. Safest bet. Last final reason that you may want to do this is due to an accident. Now, this is something I'll show you. I have a perfect example of this coming up, but my wife and I had a little bit of an incident where she bumped into one of my plants that I had on a stand drying in the garage because I'd sprayed it down, and she backed into it, knocked the plant over, and the stem snapped in half. And well, it's an unwanted, undesired, and unexpected propagation, but at that point I had to propagate it. And it was one of my favorite plants, so I kind of wanted to get that back to life. So we did do that. It succeeded, and I'm going to show you guys because that's my success story at the end of this. So when we're rooting up a top cut, we want to avoid a few things that are common, I guess, when depending on the substrate you're using, that could happen to you that could kind of mess the whole process up. And really what you want to do is try to avoid things like overwatering, underwatering, even in that stage where it's still rooting. You want to try and use a substrate that's not going to cling too badly, or at least be so dense that it gets too soggy and causes any kind of root or stem rot in your cutting. And you want to make sure that whatever cutting you've taken, obviously it's a healthy looking cutting. Ideally, you don't have any new growth on it at the same time, so you don't have a new shoot coming out simultaneously, but sometimes that's unavoidable. And you want to make sure that you are working on something that has some aerial roots, if at all possible. When I'm talking about aerial roots, I'm talking about these guys. So this, again, is another one of my Syngonium podophyllum aureus. This guy has pretty good variegation as well. He's also been propagated before, as you can see here. He's got actually like 1, 2, 3 stems going on here, I think at this point, maybe even 4. He's growing all over the place. But these guys are all fresh aerial roots that will then root up nicely if I cut them and then pop them into a nice substrate. This is a perfect example of a plant that needs propagation. It's super leggy, like all the growth is coming out like a good 6-8 inches outside of the substrate that it's in, and there's literally multiple nodes that are begging to be propagated on here. So this will be a perfect case of taking maybe even multiple top cuts from the same plant. In terms of the technique that we're going to be using, in most cases, you're going to want to have some kind of closed container or semi-closed container so that you retain the humidity inside the container and you don't lose too much dryness from the air, etc. If you have an air con or something like that, or if you have a heat pump like me, in those cases, it sucks a lot of the humidity out of the air in your house, and that can cause all of your substrates to dry out if you've got them in open air. If you're inside of a tent or an enclosure like that, then you're probably a little safer because the humidity is relative to that space and it will stay a lot more humid in general. If you're using something like an IKEA Mills bow, for instance, I got one in the other room there. If you've sealed your Mills bow, it's going to stay relatively humid inside of there too. So really, this is like for open air, you want to make sure that it stays sealed up. So that's why I've got my handy plastic 16-ounce cups here. And then I've also got some press and seal that I will show you how this is going to work together a little bit later. Another reason for keeping your substrate covered as much as you can is that you want to make sure you don't attract fungus gnats and like moist substrate. And when you're rooting something, the substrate is usually going to be relatively moist, will attract fungus gnats. And if you have ever had fungus gnats in your house, they can be a real hassle to get rid of. So I would suggest that you try and keep that covered if you've ever had fungus gnats before. It's such a pain in the butt to get rid of them afterwards. So that's why I always do bottom watering. I typically have everything in SEMIHYDRO, which is not really a great fungus gnat attractor. And anything that's not in SEMIHYDRO, again, bottom watering, trying to cover the tops of things so that they don't attract or have that space for the moisture that the fungus gnats like to get in there and lay their eggs. Those are things you want to avoid. For the good stuff, the success criteria, let's say, what do you want to see in a rooted top cutting? Well, obviously you want to see good roots. Ideally, what you want are big, fuzzy, white roots like that. Now, depending on the type of substrate you use, sometimes you can't see well enough through the substrate for anything to be visible, and sometimes it takes a long while for plants to root. Now, depending on the type of plant you got, I think all the plants that I've got here, except maybe the Florida Beauty, are pretty fast rooters. I know for a fact that the Glorious here roots like a champ. The Monstera esqueleto also roots very fast. All the Philodendrons and the Syngoniums, they root pretty quickly. So yeah, really, there's only specific plants I've had trouble with in this regard. It'll be interesting to see what the Florida Beauty does. Right now, it's more of a Florida green. You know, honestly, there's nothing left of the beauty left in here. We'll have to see how that guy does. Because really, the goal with that one is to retain variegation and get it to come back inside the base cut. So really, the top cut is not so much propagation material. It's more getting rid of the top piece of the stem so that the bottom can try and produce some more variegation. So besides the obvious of having healthy white roots, there's a couple of other things that I personally look for that may not be relevant to you, but like they're important to me when it comes to taking a top cut. One would be speed. I don't want to be sitting there for 3 or 4 months waiting for anything to happen. Ideally, the smaller the container, the looser the media that you're using in there, the easier it'll be for it to move along quickly and you'll be able to see it fast. Second for me is ease of transplantation into a soilless media. So something like leca or pond, depending on what I'm doing, maybe even something like a pumice or a perlite. So for me, that ease of transfer between the media that we're going to be using for this propagation, which is not traditional semi-hydro, and what we're going to be going to eventually, which is going to be something like leca or pond. To me, that's important. For you, it might not be important. You may be going into soil, you may be putting it into moss, you may be using some other substrate. That's fine. What I would like to do is have a substrate for me where it's easy for me to transfer my plants into semi-hydro and hopefully not have a huge acclimation time between those two steps. So you've seen the plastic cups here. You've seen that I had press and seal handy. This is looking like it's a pretty garage operation here, right? In terms of the substrate we're going to be using, what are we going to be using? We're going to be using 2 key substrates that I think work really well together for this process. The first of which is going to be tree fern fiber. Now, I have spoken about tree fern fiber relatively extensively in a previous video. I'm going to link that video up here. You can go watch that over there. Tree fern is a substrate that comes from New Zealand that is basically dried up ferns. These types of ferns are sustainable, and the only real drawback to using this stuff is that it's pricey because we're basically importing it from New Zealand. Effectively, it makes it probably 2 to 3 times the cost for us than somebody buying the same thing in New Zealand. Now, tree fern is usually used, I think, in terrariums. It's pretty common for like lizards and terrarium plants and frogs and things like that to use. I find it's a really nice propagation material, and personally, it's really great for that whole migration step I mentioned between a non-semi-hydro or rooting type of media and the actual semi-hydro final material that I'm going to be moving to, because it falls off the roots very easily when you're trying to extract a plant from the rooting media afterwards. The second thing we're going to be using is perlite. So this is pretty coarse grain perlite. Perlite is a volcanic material. The really nice thing about perlite is that it's A, very airy and fluffy, and B, that it has lots of little kind of dimples and pockmarks in its outer shells that retain water. The water just sits inside of the perlite. It just doesn't dry up very easily. So it's a really nice combination. So in terms of a ratio, I usually do about, just because the tree fern is expensive, we want to try and maintain it as much as possible. I do cut it with the perlite. I do about 30% perlite and 70% tree fern, thereabouts. I mean, I think you can go all the way up to about a 50-50 split if you want to. I personally don't have tons of perlite lying around either, so I'm going to try and balance it out a little bit. But from the tree fern goes a long way. Tree fern is also a good substitute for sphagnum moss if you're using that. I find that the tree fern retains water well and it stays hydrated, but it doesn't get clumped up and very soggy and moist bunches like sphagnum moss can do. And that's really the problem with sphagnum moss for me when I'm using it for rooting, is that it's difficult to find those clumps in the middle of the substrate that are going to then stick to the roots of your plant or to the stem and basically become anaerobic and effectively become a host for root rot and things like that. So basically that clumpiness is what I'm trying to get away from. Also, I find it's difficult to know quite like the density of water inside of your sphagnum moss is something I always have a hard time gauging. I've heard everything online about squeezing it out until you can't get any more drops of water out and it just feels moist to your hand. I've tried that and I find it just dries out really, really quickly afterwards unless you're keeping it in a closed container. So I find the tree fern is just a lot easier to handle. I can literally see the water going in there. I can see when it's moist and I can see when it's dry. And it's just, it comes off so much more easily. Like if you've ever tried to take sphagnum moss off the roots of a new cutting, that if it's been there too long, good luck. You can be sitting there for hours plucking little bits of sphagnum off there. It's such a tedious process. With the tree fern, it literally just falls off. So the other couple things I'm going to be using in this process that I should itemize right here. First off will be sulfur dust. This is really for making sure I cover up the open bits when I create a wound in the stem. If I'm chopping the stem, typically I will let it sit, kind of tamp it into some sulfur dust combined with potentially like a rooting hormone. So I've got some Promix stem root here. You can use this, or you can use, if you want to use semi-hydro, you can use something like a GH Rapid Start, works just as well. This stuff, I'll mix a little bit of this into my sulfur powder and I will just put those into a combination. I'll rub the cut stem, the arrow roots around a little bit in that before I transfer it into its new media. Finally, the other thing you might see me use is great white. You can use what you want here. I mean, like I said, for the rooting hormone, sulfur dust, none of those are required. If you want to just let your plant callus over, you can do that just as well. Let it sit for, a few hours to a day. I wouldn't wait too much longer than that, especially if it's a skinny cutting, you're going to lose a lot of moisture from there. But I'll be using this. This is a mycorrhizal inoculant. This only matters if you've got arrow roots on your plant or roots that are already in use there. If there's no roots on there, don't bother. Let's get down to business here. What does this actually look like? So I am going to chop some plants here in front of you. So first off, let me just mix up some of this media that we've been talking about, the combination of the tree fern and perlite. And then we will take a few top cuts off these plants and we're going to pot them up and then you guys can see the finished result. All right, so I've got a plastic tub here that I'm going to be using. So this is something like a 6 to 9 liter container. I'm not sure off the top of my head. It's definitely not huge. Considering this tree fern bag that I've got here is 10 liters, I think I could probably fit most of it inside of here. So I'm thinking it's probably in the neighborhood of 9 liters. I already had a little bit of tree fern still left in here. I'm just going to top this up. I only want enough to do the plants that I'm going to be chopping today. So I really don't need to use tons and tons of it. Tree fern can get a little messy, but if you ever work with perlite is even messier. I only need enough to fill up about 4 or 5 containers. So I'm just gonna take as much as I can out of here. So I think we're good here. We've used up about maybe a quarter of the bag. Tree fern is pretty dusty. You can see my hand is covered in tree fern dust. So I'm gonna wash that off and I'm gonna grab the perlite. So one problem with perlite is that it's super dusty. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm actually gonna pour out the perlite. I'll show you guys a little bit of what it looks like here, but I'm going to pour the rest of this out in my garage because I don't feel like having perlite dust in my lungs and all over my family room floor. All right, so we're done. This is just a layer of perlite. You can see this is pretty coarse grain. That is just enough to cover the tree fern. And so you can see there kind of like maybe a centimeter or so layer on top of that tree fern. And now I'm going to mix all this together and then I'll flip back to our table view. So here we go. This is all mixed up. I used regular old spoon for this process. Perlite has a tendency to want to try and migrate down to the bottom here. So you'll probably have to mix it every once in a while just to make sure that it stays decently combined. Otherwise you'll get perlite kind of gathering down at the bottom here. So here we go. We have our mix put together. The next task is to set up our plants for success here. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 of these cups. We'll see if I actually use 6. For each one of these guys, I'm going to put a little bit of a base layer. Now, you can pre-moisten your tree fern if you want to. Since I'm using a big bucket of this stuff, I may just kind of spray it down as I put it in. So I think that might be the safest bet here. So to avoid clouds of dust and just generally to know how well it's settling inside your container, you can pre-moisten the tree fern. In the past, I've pre-moistened the entire container. Since I'm using such a big bucket, I think I'm going to do it directly in the pot, but without pouring a whole bunch of water in there directly. I'm just going to use a mister and make it damp. So I've got my mister here. This is water with a couple of drops of Schultz liquid plant food in it. So not nutrient solution. This is just plain old water with a couple of drops of mild fertilizer. Finally, I'm just going to put a little bit of sulfur dust and I'm going to combine that with a teensy bit of stem rooting hormone just to put on the wounds of the plants. Just enough to rub the plant wound in there so that it can absorb a little bit into it and not be soaking wet going into the substrate. So again, just a little teensy bit. You can see here, just a little bit of sulfur dust and an even smaller bit of the rooting hormone mixed in beside it. Okay, so I'm going to take those two. Just got a pair of tweezers here. Not the most useful thing for mixing, but I'm just going to use it to mix these together. All right, that's satisfactorily mixed. I'm going to use that for my cut ends. And now I think it's time to chop. So chopping wise, we're going to do this quick and dirty. For each one of these plants, I'm going to take a top cut. I'm not going to worry too much about the rest of the plant. I've got my Monstera esqueleto here. Looks like there's a solid top cut to be taken somewhere in between the first, second nodes there. I'm not sure if I'm going to take 1 node or 2. This already has. Looks like already 1 node that's starting to pop arrow roots here. It's got one with already nice arrow roots here. I think I'm just going to take the top 2 nodes of this one. So for the esqueleto, I think I'm going to take a look here. You can see there's quite a few arrow roots going up here, and this is the top node that just kind of recently formed. This next node has some good arrow roots on it, and so does the one below. So I think I'm going to cut it right about here maybe. That looks like the safest place to cut. So I've already cleaned my scissors here. These are shears. I want to do the cleanest cut possible, so I'm using shears for this. You could use something like snips instead. I don't have mine here with me, but they'll work just as well. But I want to make a nice clean cut here, so I'm going to use the shears. I don't have a tripod handy to get any closer for these cuts, so you're just going to take a look at what I'm doing here. This one looks like the safest bet, so I'm going to go right here below the node, try and give myself as much room as possible below that node, and I'm going to snip. So there you have it. New top cut. I may actually want to take the bottom leaf on this guy off just to give it more of a chance to grow. We'll see. I'll think about that in a second. There's the remainder here. This will continue to grow, and you can see where the nice clean cut is. I'm probably going to put it back on its pole and see where it starts to decide to grow from now. So I've got my Philodendron glorious here. I'm going to take off the top 2 nodes, I think. I'll see what I can reach here. I may actually have to use my snips to get in there because it's kind of buried inside of the moss pole / leca pole, and I really don't want to take these things apart because they're such a pain in the butt to take apart. Getting it up close here, you guys can see there's the top node. This is the new shiny new leaf here, and this is the existing slightly munched leaf. You can see the light coming through here, a little bit of pock marking where it's been eaten a little bit. I'm going to try and take at least that one node there and probably the next one down. Maybe the third one as well. We'll see. Yeah, you know what? I think I can do this inside. I'm going to cut straight out here outside of the moss pole. There's a bit that I can reach that's just outside, just between the nodes. So that should give me a couple of nodes to work with. I think that's at least 2 nodes. If I cut it here, I can give myself 3. So I decided to chop basically at the part where it actually starts going into the moss pole here. That way I can continue to propagate the rest of it outside. So I'm going to give it a snip right here. There's a good spot. I think we're kind of like an inch above that node. And we're going to go here and snip. There we go. And I've got a nice clean 1, 2, 3 nodes, counting the top one, but that's probably not going to be buried right away. And I'm going to peel off these cataphyls that are still sticking on here as well. We don't want that getting in the way of any kind of propagation. There's a couple of dried up aerial roots too. I'm just getting rid of all that junk. So there you go. And it's pretty good, like a full inch below the last node, so it's got a bit of room in case it does happen to get some root rot. So for each one of these plants, I'm going to dip the bottom node and the bottom little bit of aerial root that's sticking out there in the sulfur and rooting hormone mixture. Just not a whole lot on there, just enough. Kind of coat it, let it sit. I'm going to do the same thing. This guy, I'm not going to bother with the bottom node. I'm just going to put some on the cut. Okay, and I'll keep on doing that with all the other plants too. All right, so when it comes to chopping the Syngonium aurea, I think I kind of lied. I'm probably not going to chop the one back here because I think this one has got a couple of obvious candidates on it. I think what I might do here is take a top cut off here. Let you guys take a good look there. So I think here I've got a couple of obvious candidates. I think I can probably go right around here or maybe a little bit lower down. These ones, they're kind of tangled. This guy actually belongs to the node down here. So I may chop right in between these 2 nodes here. And this, actually, I might get a bit greedy here and take a mid cut right below the top cut. Now to see how this leaf here is not opened up yet, it looks like it's pretty much close to opening up, but I may just chop below for now and keep these 2 nodes together because I want this guy to fully open up before I split them. But I may end up splitting these 2. We'll see, we'll see. Like I showed you with the close-up, I think I'm going to chop between these 2 nodes here. This is node 1. This is node 2. Now, can I get my snips in between here? That is the question. The problem with these big shears is that they're a bit on the chunky side and sometimes tough to fit in between tight spaces like I've got here. Between this petiole and the stem here, I don't want to damage the petiole of the leaf that I'm not taking off. So I think what I'll do is I'll use my snips, which are little finer tip ones. That'll work a bit better. With this guy, I pulled out the snips. These are a little finer tip. I have also cleaned these guys with isopropyl alcohol, rubbing alcohol at the same time. So now I can actually reach in between this petiole and what looks like another aerial root down here. So I'm gonna make sure I don't kill any aerial roots on the way through. I'm gonna chop right about here. And it does look like it has actually a piece of aerial root caught in there. Interesting. This guy's actually aerial rooted into itself somehow. The aerial root here is actually somehow stuck itself into the petiole of the node below. So interestingly enough, I'm gonna have to cut this probably right about here. So if I can't get it out the old-fashioned way, like it's pulling, I'm going to give it a chop. There we go. Okay, so I've still got two very viable arrow roots there and a piece of another one that was somehow hilariously embedded in the petiole below. So the rest of this plant is looking good, and this guy will just end up self-propagating down one of the lower nodes. I mean, there's so many nodes on this thing that are ready to go that I'm just going to let it go back to its natural state here. So again, I've got 2 leaves here and one below. So you know what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to chop right in between. I'll take my shears so I get a bit better cut here. And that way I can cheat and get 2 propagations for the price of 1. So they're about there. Perfect. So now I have 2 of these. This one is green, but it does have a hint of variegation right there on the edge. And this one is clearly nicely variegated, and it has the new leaf coming. So 1 node here, 1 node there. I'm just going to put them side by side and let them grow together. And let's actually seal those off. So I'm going to put a teensy bit of the sulfur powder on here. It's always tricky to get the top end of these cuttings. I'll put a little bit of sulfur powder mixed with the stem root. I'm going to put it beside its brother here. Let's do the same thing here. Just dip the bottom end that was cut. All I'm doing is just kind of caking on a little layer there, if you can see that. Okay, so now we're at 3 plants down. This is good. It's forcing me to do some propagations that I've been putting off forever. And I may actually go back and take mid-cuts from all these guys and throw them into a prop box later. So we'll see. Now, when I'm talking about a mid-cut, I mean one that's kind of in between the top cut and a bottom cut or a mid-cut. So you've got cut stem on both ends of there. Kind of shapes like a T if you think about it. Those guys, they are slower to root in general. They're not going to grow from the same point. They're actually going to grow from an axillary bud on the side there. In that case, these guys are slower. So typically I sometimes just take the leaf off and I'll throw that into a prop box with just the actual stem piece in there. Sometimes I'll leave the leaf on depending on how I'm feeling. Syngoniums propagate very easily, so I'm not super worried about this one. So I'll probably just put it with the top cut and see how it does. So at this point in the video, it's traditional to ask for a like or subscribe. I will do as is traditional and ask you if you appreciate this kind of content, you find it useful, you find it entertaining, you find it educational. Please do drop a like on the video because it helps us with the algorithm. If you have any questions or suggestions, you can drop those below. I read everything and I answer everything. So I'm happy to engage with you down there. So let's keep going and let's pot up a few more things before we get to the finale. All right, next I think we're gonna go with the Florida Beauty, which is now a Florida Green, unfortunately. This guy, I'm going to need to cut this one all the way down just to be able to kind of revive some of the variegation that was in there. The stem is so narrow on these Floridas that it's really hard to see any type of stem variegation. That's normally what you're looking for with this type of variegation, is to try and see if you can spot some variegation on the stem and see if it runs along one of the nodes. But in this case, I can't see anything. It's so skinny that it's really hard to tell whether I'm looking at dirt or variegation. So I think I'm going to take off at least the top cut plus maybe 1-2 more below that. I think I'll leave the top cut. Let's take the Velcro off first. So if you guys are wondering what this stuff is, this here is plant Velcro. I use it all the time, particularly when I'm using any kind of climbing plant on a stake or anything like that. Sadly, no longer a Florida Beauty, looking like a Florida Green here. Very, very green leaves. So you can see my pile of top cuts and 1 mid cut here so far. And this is the Florida with its wimpy little stem here that I cannot see any variegation on. So what I'm going to try and do here is I'm going to cut down at least the top couple of nodes, pretty much anywhere on here. I think I may have to go down below. This was the last propagation here, I think. That looks about where it was propagated last. I can see that there. I kind of wanted to try and propagate below this because I know they had variegation down here. The leaves above this I'm not entirely sure of, so yeah, I may take a couple of stem cuts while I'm at it and put those into my prop box. So with this guy, I'm at least going to take a couple of nodes from the top here. So I've got 1, 2, 3. I know the internode space on the Floridas is quite long. So I'm just going to feel my fingers, and I don't feel a node where there's a gap there as an internode. Actually, I'm going to use my shears because they're quicker to cut and don't crush quite as much. Cut there. Okay. So there's my top cut that I may end up separating. It's a little kind of ugly the way it is, and you can see it's reverted to juvenile state up top here. It's been sitting inside of a box with very low light for the last little while. Now this stump here, I am hesitant to say, but you can see there was a propagation done right here, and this node here was the fresh stem above it. So I've got 1 node above it, I've got 1 node or 2 below it, so I'm just going to let it sit here and see if I can get it to regrow. I'm a bit worried about spent nodes on this one, that maybe I already had 1 or 2 spent nodes at the bottom. So that's why I'm being careful with it. Take a closer look here at the propagation. The internodal spacing on these two is so tight. I am really hesitant to take these two apart. Yeah, I can see the bump on the side there. So this guy, what I was saying about the internodal space being tight, you can see what I mean here. This is very tight. Now, what I'm actually going to do is I see here, there is what looks like that little bump there, the green bump in the center, kind of right above my finger. That, I believe, is an axillary bud. So I want to cut right below that, and that should hopefully be the node that we get a new leaf out of. Of course, I don't see any variegation along the stem here. Not at all, but it's kind of crusty too. It's got some bark growing on it. This is going to be a full-on guess to see what happens. I have no idea if this is going to work or not. So gonna chop right below that. So just like I showed you guys in the close-up, here we go. Chop right below and hopefully not catch it at the same time. Okay, so there we go. We have this guy, which is right up against it. All right, and then we have this guy who has what looks like, you know, in this case, the axillary bud is kind of directly behind the petiole, so it's pretty much a fool's errand here. I have no idea if this is going to work or not. You know what? I may take this bottom leaf off just to give it a little bit more room to root at the bottom here. But yeah, there's not a whole lot of plant material on here. Worst case scenario, though, I've got probably 3-4 nodes on here at least. I've got at least 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 even. So there's a good chance that this will produce some new growth. Again, this is an experiment, so I think I may actually take the bottom leaf off of here, just so I don't have petioles sitting in the substrate too much. I don't know. I'm gonna leave it on for now. Okay, so let's give these guys a little bit of a dunk again. All the open wounds, give them a little bit of a treatment. That's 1, that's 2. Okay, those are good. And since they're kind of damp already, they're sticky, they've got some resiny kind of sap in there, this material sticks right to it. All right, final plant, I think. Maybe, maybe not. I'm not sure about this one. This one is an interesting case. This is my Paraiso Verde. This was already a top cutting that has become kind of strangely skinny at the bottom. I guess like that bottom, I can't even tell which one. It looks like this is the main stem here, but the main stem is so skinny that the arrow roots beside it are basically the same size. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take off the top chunk. And I'm just looking, there's a lot of arrow roots here that are quite thick and barky. And I think if I put them in a substrate, we'll be relatively happy. And there's one nice long one here. The rest of these guys, they're already in the substrate, so I'm going to let them remain in the substrate. In this case, it's leca. All right, just so you guys can see what I'm talking about here. This is very, very skinny. And this appears to be the original cutting, which then got quite thick up here. Lost a couple of leaves, I'm assuming. And now it's got quite a thick stalk that's happening right here. Like that stem is pretty thick, but it's ridiculously thicker than the rest of it down here. And these are 2 arrow roots that are actually in the leca already. I'm going to leave those alone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and cut, I think, below. You know, this arrow root is at the same level, I think, as these other nodes. I would love to get that curly arrow root that's flowing upwards there as part of the cutting. Let's see if I can cut between here and that curly one on the other side. This one's a bit of a challenging cut, so let's see what happens there. All right, I have to be careful with this one. I think I can get it. There's a lot of arrow roots kind of sticking out here and there in between though. I don't want to cut anything prominent here. If I can get away with using the shears, I will. I think if we get in here, I can do it like that. I think I just got it. Perfect. Okay, so I've got the big curly arrow root that I wanted right there. I've got a few more arrow roots coming up above. And I'm just going to leave this all as one cutting. It's going to be a little awkward with this leaf kind of below. I'm going to have to push him into the substrate, maybe at an angle for now, just because I don't want to take that leaf off, because look at that variegation. Again, good variegation. Now the bottom cut here, hopefully, since it's already got multiple nodes, it's got a piece of stem with a couple of nodes there that are attached. I think I cut it without damaging the arrow roots that were already coming out of it. And it has 2 arrow roots that are already in this tangled mess of roots down here. See if I can pop this out for you guys to look at, but it's really in there. Wow, it's really, really in there. Let's see if I can pop this out. So you guys can kind of look at the roots that are happening inside of this thing. Yeah, it's pretty root bound, and the roots are quite healthy. I mean, there's like white fuzzy roots in there. Let's see if you can get a good look at that. I mean, there's a lot of algae, but this plant was perfectly healthy. So I'm hoping that there's enough stem material here for it to propagate once more. So that goes aside. And this guy, again, I'm going to give the old cut end a dump. There we go. I think we're good on the chopped end here. I'm going to leave that sit with the rest of these guys. It's quite sappy, so I'm going to need to wash my hands after that one. So the interesting thing about actually both the Philodendron florida and the Philodendron Paraiso Verde here have extra floral nectaries. I don't know if you can see it from that distance here, but there's some shine on here. There's this sappy type of substance on the kind of base of the leaves and a lot on the stem and on the petioles. Mostly on the petioles. It doesn't really serve any purpose in pollination directly. It's more of an attractor from what I understand. So that's something that you'll see. Your hands will get a little sticky after cutting those guys, or even after touching the petioles. So I've got this big pile of cuttings here now, and we've got 5 different cuttings plus a couple of spares, I think. What we're going to do next here is pot these guys up. I almost forgot. I have this monster. This is my Anthurium marmoratum. I don't know if you can see how big this leaf is. This is probably 16 inches long now. I think the last time I talked to you guys and showed you this plant, it might have been this dude down here, who's a little crispy looking. This plant, I don't know, I think it just tears itself unfurling, but it still produces huge leaves. And I mean, it has 0 support. And as you can see, the stem is getting thicker and thicker as it goes along here. But it's supporting itself on something that's like not even a half a centimeter thick. So, I mean, I have 6 cups, and I didn't plan this. I just happened to grab the first 6 cups that were at the top of the pile. I may as well have 6 plants to put in here. I was thinking about cutting this guy. The problem with Anthuriums is cutting them is sometimes very difficult because of the amount of sheer junk on there and lack of internodal space. So why don't we try and take a top cut of this huge monster here and see if I can get him to stabilize himself a little bit lower down. I'm going to do this the old-fashioned way and take the very first couple of nodes that I can reach here. As I said, this is a bit of a challenge. You can see here the stem is pretty crusty and covered in gunk. I'm going to have to peel off a couple of these bits, and I'll see if maybe I can cut kind of right below. There's the top leaf here, which is massive. And see if maybe I can cut the 1 node there, 2 nodes. See what I can grab underneath this. I might need to use my my razor to cut this guy.
12 seconds later.
I gave this guy a little bit of a cleanup. I pulled off what I could, so it's a little bit cleaner. And there's, again, the top leaf. You can see that there. And I'm going to maybe try and chop right below this arrow root here. And I'm going to get, it looks like to be maybe 1 or 2 nodes beneath this. So I'm going to do what I can to grab this. With these Anthuriums, it's sometimes hard to not chop through a node or through an arrow root when propagating. I'm going to do my best. It's very tight. As you can see, there's the internodal space is super small there. There's like maybe 3 or 4 millimeters in between each one. See if I can hit that with my shears here. Wish me luck. All right, we are going to snip here and see what I can grab without killing anything too badly. This is where... Okay, I got through most of it, and I'm a little bit below an arrow root, so I'm going to grab that too. Okay, it took 2 chops. This little nub here is done most likely. It's looking like it's a little bit chopped in half, but I got most of those arrow root nubs plus at least a couple of nodes here. So, relatively clean cut. Didn't damage the bottom part of the stump there at all. Looks like it's in pretty good shape. All right, now he's kind of back to the size he was the last time you saw him. And this huge monster is going to get propagated. And this is going to be interesting to see what happens because propagating big leaves doesn't always work. And I'm going to show you something that's pretty cool. Not a big leaf, but something close to kind of prove to you that this method works pretty well. So here we go. I've got 1, 2, another bud, and the one I chopped a little bit part of the way through there, which I guess I'll leave alone, although maybe it's worth taking it off because it's kind of in the way. So I'm going to take that bit off that didn't quite make it there. Okay, I think we're pretty clean there for the most part. I'll take that and we'll give it the old dip. Make sure we get that coated pretty well. I'm going to let all this sit for about 15 minutes or so. So this is not letting it callus over. This is mostly just letting it dry out teensy bit. With the sulfur and rooting hormone combination on there, it's pretty much just letting it kind of dry a bit in the meantime. If you were doing this without the sulfur and the rooting hormone and you just wanted to do it air callusing, you could do that too. In that case, I would leave it for at least a couple of hours after cutting it, if not maybe 3 or 4 hours. Sometimes you could wait till the next morning. If your plant is particularly skinny, like one of these guys, leaving it till morning, it may wilt down and not want to propagate nearly as well. Play it by ear with the cutting that you're working with, but in this case, I'm just going to let them sit for about 15-20 minutes.
15 minutes later.
In the meantime, I'm going to prepare my containers for all these guys. and put a little bit of foundational media in each one of these. So the next task here is that I'm going to set up a bit of a base layer. So in each one of these guys, I'm going to put a little foundational layer of the substrate. So our mix here, this is the perlite and tree fern. So I'm going to take my spoon here. Remember, this stuff is dusty, so if you actually put the whole container in here, it's going to get covered in muck. So just going to spoon in maybe a few scoops here. Oof, that is dusty. So I've got a decent amount of space for roots to form. And then I'll place my cutting in each one of them. So I'm just going to do an even amount in all of these for now. So just, you know, about an inch or so at the bottom of the cup. See how dusty that is already, just from me putting stuff into it. So that's one. So let's do all 6 of these. I'll quickly fast forward through this. It's pretty dusty. If you're doing this at home, I recommend you don't put your face as close as mine is to this box when you're doing it. Just inhaling perlite dust and tree fern dust at the same time, not a great combination. All right, so I've got all 6 of these ready now. 6 cups, they've all got about inch and a half of substrate in them. Now, the next thing I'm gonna do is just moisten these down a little bit because these are gonna be the foundational layer that I'm gonna put the base of my cutting in. And I'm not gonna be able to soak these super well once I put the rest of the cutting in. So I'm gonna give them a little bit of a spritz with my water / plant food combination. Like I said, a couple of drops of just your off-the-shelf plant food works fine. So giving these a little bit of a spray to moisten them down, 3, 4, kind of 5 sprays each. Then I'll give them all a stir. Whoa, okay. That was not fun. Let's do that covered more. Jesus, it's blowing right out of there. Okay, it's slightly messier than I expected. Mister is a little bit more powerful than you would think. A little bit of moisture in there. I've spritzed it a few times. This is not watering, this is just kind of moistening it down a little bit, so it's not so much of a hassle afterwards. So I'm going to start with the things closest to me, I think. So let's go with the Floridas. You know what? Trying to fit this Florida in there is going to be interesting. I'm going to go like that. I'm going to go like that. So I'm going to place these guys in a way where the roots or the existing nodes, so like this guy doesn't really have any arrow roots, so I'm not really going to waste my time with Myco with it. Same thing here. Nothing on this bit. So I'm going to pop these guys in so that they're kind of at equivalent levels and that they've got pretty decent root coverage in there. I'm just going to top it off with more of the tree fern fiber so that there's a coating on top. I can probably put the base layer a little bit higher on this guy. Don't be shy about covering up the existing stem. Let's see if I can place that now. I want to try and keep these guys, have a little bit of a space between them. Probably would have been better if I took off that bottom leaf here. I'm tempted to do that right now just to make it fit. And since there's going to be rooting happening all around it, you know what? I'm going to do that. Just never nice cutting off a leaf that you don't need to remove, but in this case, I think, yeah, it's better off without it. So now these 2 guys, even though they're sized down, and there's the growing tip here, the apical bud. I'm going to pop this in here, and now they can kind of reside at the same level as the other cutting, and I don't have to worry about them interfering too much. Oh, let's cover these guys up. Whoa, this guy's jumping out. Okay, this is where my next tip is going to come in handy shortly. So make sure that the growing tip is not covered, but that the nodes are covered. So I want to make sure that we've got all the nodes surrounded by the tree fern fiber. That looks good. Okay, just so you guys can see what I'm doing there. I'm going to do the rest of these the same way. This one just wants to jump out. It's kind of off balance. Now, what happens here is the most important part of this for a couple of different reasons. Now, this guy really doesn't want to stay down. So you can, if you got plant staples, you can use those to hold things down. In my case, I don't think I have that handy. You could also use something like a paper clip if you have one. It's, you know, stainless steel paper clip, that would work just as well. I'm going to use my press and seal. Taking a corner of the press and seal. I'm going to reuse this, so I've got like 2 large squares out of each one of these. So I'm going to cut this guy, and then I'm going to cut it in half. So I'm going to do that. There we go. That's kind of 2 equalish pieces. I'm going to take this guy, and now I'm going to cut a couple of slots for my plant to work around. So in this case, since there's 2 cuttings in here, it's not the most ideal of situations, but I'm going to cut it kind of half and half. Tear a bit there. So I've torn a piece here. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Cut enough so I can get the 2 plant bits out. The 2 petioles that are in there. I'm going to get those both out. I'm cutting 2 kind of angled cuts. From there, tear that a bit. I'm going to tear this a bit if I can. I'm going to try and shove this in between everything. So I've got this here, and I've got this around the first leaf. I lined it up pretty much perfectly. That's great. Okay, so now I'm going to press this down around the edges. What you want to do is make a good seal with the press and seal. You can probably use plastic wrap for this too. Maybe on plastic it doesn't work quite so well. The Glad press and seal, or whatever your equivalent is that you can find at your local grocery store, it works better with the plastic on plastic contact because it makes a good seal right on the edge like that. And then I'm just going to make sure it wraps around. If you want to, you can make a little watering hole in the middle. I will just water through the existing slits that are in there. Now this guy is solidly in there. I'm going to move on to the next one. So you guys have seen this. I'm going to fast forward through potting up the rest of these guys, except if something really interesting comes up that I want to show you. One thing you want to keep in mind when you're filling these guys up is to make sure that you have enough of the medium in here to cover up all of the nodes that you expect to be able to propagate from. So basically right up to the top of where the existing growth is, and then just leave a little bit of clearance at the top so new growth can pop through there. And also if you already have that apical bud, which is the growing tip of your plant, like this guy here, that you don't cover that up. So here, make sure that the soil goes to like right above this aerial root that's there and just stops about there. So why don't we start with that one next. So in this case, since I do have some aerial roots, actually I have 3 aerial roots on this one, and I have what looks like 2 and a bit more coming on this guy here. On the Syngonium aurea, I'm going to use a little bit of myco on here. So this myco that I'm using is the Great White. This is actually kind of multi-purpose. You can use this one in solution, or you can use it as a powder, which I'm using right now. So I'm just going to use a teensy bit of it as a powder. This stuff is kind of like gold, so you don't want to use too much of it, and you definitely don't want to do what I just did and throw a bunch of it on the table. So yeah, don't do what I did there, and make sure you don't lose half your myco off the edge of the table. So myco, it's this brown, kind of mushroomy looking stuff. I don't know if it's visible in the light there. That's the Great White myco. I'm going to pop this in just so the aerial roots touch it a little bit. So just kind of dust it on there, and then I pop that in here. Do the same thing with the other one that has much longer aerial roots. Okay, if your plant does not have roots, or if your node does not have roots, don't bother with this because this only works with roots. Okay, that's pretty good. Let's give it a little bit more of the substrate. And make sure you also want to have enough of the substrate underneath for the plant to actually have room to root a decent amount. And if you don't leave enough room down there, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot with this whole process. So you want to have at least probably a couple of inches would be great beneath the base of the plant and kind of where it has time to and space to root. That would be good. These guys facing the right way. I want my growing tip there. And this guy, I want him to face this way because the stem is going around here. This is going to settle a little bit once you water it down too. So you can tap it a little bit and get it to settle by itself. And then I'm going to do my usual trick. Cut each sheet in half and you're getting a lot more out of it. Just tear a bit this way, tear a bit this way. A little more than I wanted, but that's okay. I'm going to tuck this around. So the good thing about this is it seals in the humidity pretty well. I mean, you're leaving a gap around the growing tip of your plant like I'm doing here, where I've got a gap around there and just enough for petioles to stick out. You're not losing a ton of humidity in there, so once you've got it moistened, most of the moisture will stay inside and you'll get a little bit of evaporation outside of those holes. Okay, so that's 2. The other good thing about the tree fern is that you can see the wet color is kind of a darker brown. And when you start putting in more of it, you can see that it's a lighter brown when it's not wet. So it's very obvious to tell whether it's moistened properly or not. Where I sprayed it down, it's nice and dark brown. So if there's moisture in there, you're going to know about it. I think on this guy, I'm actually going to take the bottom leaf off too. It's similar to what I did with the Florida Beauty. I'm going to take this bottom leaf because I want more of these exposed aerial roots to be in the substrate. And I don't want petiole or leaf in the substrate. If the petiole gets in there, it's just going to rot anyways. So you're better off just pulling the damn thing off. You still got 2 leaves and another leaf about to pop here. So I'm not too worried about this one. I think it will root just fine. It's got aerial roots galore all the way along the 2 nodes at the bottom, and it's got a 3rd node coming here. So these guys love to vine, and I'd like to size this one up if I can. So I'm going to try and have this as the base of a larger plant than the one I already had. This one I want to try and bury those 2 nodes, so I'm actually going to start it a little bit lower down here. And that way I've got 1 bottom node already in there. 2nd node I'm going to bury with the substrate now too. And again, with this guy, I'm going to put a bit of the myco on here because it does have some arrow roots. So I'm just kind of dunking the arrow roots into the myco as best as I can. There we go, nice and brown. Kind of looks like you've got mushrooms growing off of it. Pop that in here now. Okay, 1, 2, we're both in. Let's cover these up. So you can see the amount of material I made. I've already kind of gone through about half of it here. And I'm on my 3rd plant, so that's about right. I might have a little bit left over at the end that I can use for another plant. We'll see. I kind of want to pack this one in enough that it holds itself up reasonably well. Don't want to cover too much of the stem. Now this guy, since he's only got the main top cutting in here, he's pretty centered, I want to say. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Okay, and I'm going to now do my present seal down here. Cut a couple more squares, something like that. And I'll cut this down the middle. That's centered. Okay, let's cut that. We'll cut a center hole for this guy. I'm just going to cut in half, basically. That's all right. There we go. See, when I was talking about cutting these guys and then letting them sit out of water or out of any kind of moisture for a while, this is a perfect example. This guy, this leaf is already getting a little floppy, just for what it's worth. So it's probably a good thing I took that bottom leaf off. That's less leaves to try and maintain with no root system. Better off this way. Now I know these guys root pretty quickly, so I am not particularly concerned about it. But I may end up, we'll see. We'll see if this leaf survives. It's already pretty floppy. Once I get some more moisture into the substrate here, it should be a little happier. Let's do these last 3 quickly. I think I'm going to go with the top cut of the Philodendron glorious, just because it's been waiting the longest since the esqueleto. I think this is the 2nd one I cut, right? Guy's in there, a little floppy, but he'll survive. Okay, 4 down, a couple more. This guy's a little different. I have to cover the growing tip a little bit because it's not really visible yet and it's kind of right at the base of the stem. So I know with these guys, as long as it's not too wet, the Anthurium will probably pop right through there and not worry about it. So more a problem of keeping him straight up. So I may actually have to give this guy support to be able to stand in here without falling down. So I'm going to go do that for a second.
A few moments later.
Alrighty, I am going to now pop in. I've got this support stake here. I'm going to put him in right behind just to keep him in place. And then I'm going to put a little bit of plant tape so it doesn't rattle around too much. This is already going to drag, so I'm going to have to put this on a I'm gonna have to put this on something where it doesn't flop off. All right, it's already feeling like it wants to tip. Okay, so another strip of resin seal for these last 2. So you can see I barely used like maybe 1.5 foot of the resin seal for 6 plants. Your key material that you're gonna be dealing with here is the tree fern fiber. Perlite is pretty cheap. You can find perlite pretty much anywhere. Even your garden centers will have perlite, and perlite, you can get a big bag of perlite for like $8 or $10, maybe 15 for a larger bag. And that should keep you going for a long while. Really, besides the plants, the tree fern is your primary expense. And we're not using entirely tree fern, so taking the edge off of that is nice. And combining with the perlite makes it a little fluffier, makes the water retention a little bit more better. Adds a little bit of chunkiness in there. It's a good combination. Okay, so this guy is pretty massive. I think I'm just popping here for now so it doesn't fall off the table. And last but not least, now this guy, I don't know how I'm going to deal with him. We have to pull this leaf up a little bit, I think. What I'm going to do is I'm going to plant tape this guy together a little higher up. Definitely a faux pas here in terms of cutting a plant that has a leaf that's about to pop. It's got like 50% formed leaf there. But for the purposes of demonstration, you guys get to see me potentially kill this thing. Hopefully not. So I'm pulling these leaves a little bit closer together. So this way, these guys will not interfere with each other too much, but still fit and be able to put the root system in there. So there we go. I'm going to use a little bit more of my myco. So we got myco on there. All right, and into this final container. I'm going to put a little bit more at the bottom because I have room here below this root system. I still want to have a decent amount of this plant in here so that it doesn't topple over constantly. So it's playing a game of balance versus root system space. There, this actually looks pretty good the way it is. Hopefully we'll hold together reasonably well. So as you can see here, we've used pretty much most of the container. Might be enough there for one more plant if I were using it. I'm not going to. So with 6 of these cups full, I've used up maybe a third of a small bag of tree fern, so maybe 2-3 liters worth. So, you know, at the price you're talking about, you probably want to save this for plants that mean something to you, that are important, like whether they're collector's plants or something that you're having a really hard time rooting, that sort of thing. For your everyday plants that you know are going to root easily, I wouldn't waste the tree fern on that. So it's kind of like the special occasion stuff here. The most important part you want here is to seal the press and seal around the edge of your cup so that you don't have like air leakage through there and humidity leakage. It's just going to be isolated to where the plant is popping out through the middle. It will retain most of its humidity this way. All right, so the next thing you want to do is take all these guys and water them a little bit. Now, with these guys, since there's like just this substrate and nothing else underneath, there's no leca, there's no pond in there, no semi-hydro at all, you can give it probably maybe a centimeter worth of water at the bottom. That will get absorbed up through the tree fern. So you can kind of water through the hole we've created at the top here, or if you want to lift off a corner and just kind of water along the side of the cup, that works too. Don't overwater it. You want to see light saturation of the substrate so that you see it go from kind of that light brown color, which it mostly is right now, to a bit of a dark brown color. I'll show you with these guys. I think it's a bit more visible here. Kind of that light brown color. You want to see it turn to more of the darker color at the bottom. Now, we don't want to soak it. We want it to just be moist. And at the end of the day, there's nothing else to it. That's pretty much the gist of it, is to basically mix your 30% perlite, 70% tree fern with a combination if you want to use rooting hormone, that sort of thing, myco. Those are all optional. Again, really all you really need is those 2 first ingredients, your cup and your cover. And if you need a stake, you put a stake in there. Otherwise, you're good to go. And all those guys should hopefully root pretty well. Now, at the end of this, you're like, hey, where's the evidence that this works? I will do a follow-up video in 4 or so weeks. I think 4 weeks is a fair amount of time to wait. It's not too long, not too short. You feel like it's doing something. At the end of that 4 weeks, I will post a video with an update. You guys can take a look at those. But in the meantime, I actually have done this before, and I want to show you the results from my last attempt at this. So going back to the beginning of our conversation when I talked about reasons you may want to do this and take a top cut and propagate it, one of the reasons is accidents. I told you about my wife and I bumping into each other and knocking over a plant. In this case, it was actually this Anthurium papillomanum blue, which this was an import that really mattered a lot to me. And this thing got snapped in half, and I took the top cut and I buried it. And I plunked it into this exact combination I've shown you guys. I think this has been about 6 weeks, and that I took the bottom cut. I left the bottom cut sitting in my tent. It's going to take a while to start coming back. Bottom cuts on Anthuriums with no leaves usually take a very long time. Now the top cut, however, this guy, this is the leaf that was on there, and there's very little damage. I mean, it already had a little bit of trips damage, I think, this guy. But, I mean, this leaf curl at the bottom is really all that we're seeing. I'll show you what I'm looking at there. There's a teeny bit of crispiness at the bottom there, but there's actually new growth popping up the top here. I just saw it today. Second off, the roots are going crazy. So there is roots everywhere on here. And I'm loath to take this out of its pot, but I mean, the roots are actually popping up above the soil. I think what I may do is take a look and see what's going on. So we're just going to pop this out. I'll take the plastic wrap off. This is moist tree fern combined with perlite. It's the same mix I showed you today. So there's actually roots, if you can believe it, popping above the surface of the material. So here's one that's actually popping up out. And that's nuts. I mean, at first I thought, like I was seeing this and I thought maybe I was seeing the original arrow roots that were on here because they just had kind of little bud arrow roots. And I'm thinking to myself going like, it can't be that fast. Maybe I'm just seeing like a clump of perlite. But then I kept watching it day after day and I saw the sheer amount of roots that were being produced in here. And it's got like, there's at least a dozen roots that are longer than an inch surrounding the entire cup, and it's happy as a clam in here. So now that I see new growth, I see right here, take a look at that. There's that new growth. There's that root we're talking about. It's a little bit crispy at the end because it's sitting in the air. I'll give you a zoom on it so you can see. Take a look at all of these roots. They are everywhere. And I mean, rooting pappies is not the easiest thing on earth. But this guy, and this is a beautiful plant, this papillamum blue. I'm really, really keen to see what this looks like when it's big. But there you go, new growth right there. I checked that 2 days ago. There was no new growth. But that little red point in the middle is new growth. And I'm super excited to see where that goes. So now at this point, I think this is getting pretty much ready to transplant. Now, if I wanted to move this into semi-hydro, I pretty much could. I can pull this out. I'm not going to do it in front of you guys just because this is one of those treasured plants that I don't really want to take out and potentially damage. But I'll probably experiment when we do our update video on the rest of these guys after the month has passed. I'm going to put them all in my tent and see how they do. But this guy, just for reference, has been sitting in open air, hence probably the crispiness at the end here, open air on top of my Millsbo cabinet on a heat mat. That's it. So the heat mat's keeping it around 21, 22 degrees Celsius. And it's just contact at the bottom and that's it. And it's been sitting there with an LED light that's not particularly bright. It's sharing the LED light with a dozen other plants up there. And that's it, in open air. And I've watered it once. So I watered it in the initial time that I put it in here. And I added a bit of water just because there's going to be some humidity loss through the opening that we have in the press and seal there. I've watered it one time since then. And it's still decently watered. Like I can feel like this is still moist. There's still moisture in there. I can see the moisture when it's heating up. Right now you can't so much because it's been sitting out for a while. But you can see moisture and condensation on the side of the cup here. Still a little bit here. Yeah, this has been sitting there. I've only had to water it one time. I only put in a little bit of water last time too. And you can feel it's got some heft to it. So it's got plenty of water. Potentially too much water. You need to be careful with that. You don't want to rot the roots. So there you go. This is my success story using this method. Works great. This is the Anthurium papillamum blue. I'll show you a picture of this big up here so you can take a look and see what it looks like once it's fully matured. So now we have 6 new plants. This is a pretty good spread to show how well this works, so I'm going to come back to this. Thank you for sticking around with me today. Hopefully this was useful. Hopefully it was a fun experiment to take part in, and I will check back with you in about 4 weeks to give you an update. If you're enjoying this kind of material, you are one of my peeps, so if you're not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe to the channel because, hey, I'll give you an update in 4 weeks and we'll see how this goes. And yeah, I'd love to have you as part of my community. If you have any comments, questions, suggestions, throw those below and I will answer. I answer everything, I read everything. If you'd like me to try an experiment or maybe try something out that you guys have found useful, I'm happy to try that too if I have the materials to do it. Thanks again for your time. I'm Nick from Proppist, and I will catch you in the next one.